My grandfather taught me to play chess the summer I turned 8, sitting across from him at a small wooden table by the window of his cluttered study, sunlight falling in slow-moving patterns across a board he had owned longer than my mother had been alive. "Chess isn't about being clever, Sam," he told me that first afternoon, arranging the pieces with hands that already, even then, had begun to tremble slightly. "It's about patience. Anyone can make a flashy move. It takes a wiser kind of person to make the quiet move that actually wins the game 3 turns later." I didn't understand what he meant. Not really. Not at 8 years old. I just liked the way the pieces felt in my hand. The particular satisfaction of a well-placed knight. The small thrill of finally, after a dozen humiliating losses, managing to corner his king. My grandfather's study smelled like old books and pipe tobacco he'd quit years before I was born, but whose scent seemed to have soaked permanently into the shelves. There was a particular ritual to our Sundays. My grandmother would bring us tea and a small plate of biscuits around 3 o'clock, always at exactly the same time, always with the same gentle comment about how we'd both go blind squinting at those little wooden men in the afternoon light. My grandfather would simply smile and wave her off affectionately, and we'd keep playing until the light through the window turned gold, then orange, then finally faded into evening. He never let me win. Not once, not even when I was small enough that most adults would have softened the blow. "Losing honestly teaches you more than winning easily ever will," he told me, the day I cried after my 6th straight defeat. It took me almost 2 years of Sundays before I won my first game against him fairly, and I remember the particular pride on his face that afternoon. Not disappointment at losing, but genuine delight, as though he'd been waiting patiently the entire 2 years for exactly that moment to arrive. We played every Sunday afternoon for the next 11 years. Through my parents' divorce, through my awkward teenage years, through the slow, quiet decline that eventually crept into my grandfather's hands and mind alike. That chessboard by the window remained the one constant appointment in both our lives that neither of us ever missed. By the time I was 19, home from my first year of college, I noticed the games had started slowing down. Not because my grandfather had grown weaker as a player, but because he had started taking long, unexplained pauses between moves, staring at the board with an expression I couldn't quite name, somewhere between concentration and something sadder. "Are you all right, Grandpa?" I asked him on one particular Sunday, watching him hold a bishop in his hand for nearly a full minute before finally setting it down. "I'm just thinking a few extra moves ahead these days," he said, with a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. An old man's habit. I didn't press him further. I wish now that I had. It was my mother who finally told me the truth, 3 weeks later, over a phone call I took standing in my dorm room stairwell, my heart sinking with every word she said. "It's his heart, Sam," she said. "The doctors say it's failing. They're not sure how much time he has left. Weeks, maybe a couple of months if we're lucky." I came home the following weekend, and every weekend after that, abandoning classes I would later have to scramble to make up, unwilling to let a single Sunday afternoon pass without sitting across that small wooden table one more time. The games changed after the diagnosis, though not in the way I expected. My grandfather didn't grow more cautious, more protective of the little time he had left. If anything, he grew bolder, taking risks on the board he'd never taken before, sacrificing pieces I'd have expected him to guard fiercely, as though something in him had decided that caution, at this stage of his life, was no longer worth the trouble. "You're playing differently," I told him one Sunday afternoon, after he'd sacrificed his queen in an opening I didn't recognize from any of our 11 years of games together. "I'm playing exactly the way I should have played my whole life," he said, watching my confused expression with quiet amusement. "I spent 60 years protecting every piece on this board like it was precious cargo, Sam. I'm learning, a little late, that some pieces are worth losing if it means opening up a better position for what comes next." I thought, at the time, that he was only talking about chess. There was another Sunday, not long after, when he set down his cup of tea and told me, almost casually, about a trip to Portugal he and my grandmother had always talked about taking, but never managed to arrange. First because of money, then because of my mother's schooling, then because retirement never quite felt like the right moment either. "I keep thinking about that trip we never took," he admitted, moving a pawn forward with more hesitation than the move required. 60 years of telling ourselves there would be time. "You could still go," I said, though even as I said it, we both understood how unlikely that had become. "Maybe," he said, though his eyes told me he already knew the honest answer. "But I've started thinking there are other trips left to take. Smaller ones. This conversation, for instance. Telling you these things now, instead of assuming I'd get around to it eventually, that's its own kind of trip, isn't it? A late one, but not too late." I didn't fully understand in that moment how deliberately he was trying to use whatever time remained. I only understood it much later, looking back on all those small, uncharacteristic risks he'd started taking, at the board and everywhere else. The last time we played, 3 days before he passed, my grandfather could barely sit upright in his hospital bed, an oxygen tube resting beneath his nose, his once steady hands now shaking so badly that I had to move the pieces for him, following his soft, halting instructions. "Knight to F3, he whispered, and I moved it for him. We played slowly that afternoon, the game stretching over nearly 2 hours, far longer than any single match we'd ever played at that little table by the window. I found myself, more than once, blinking back tears I didn't want him to see, trying to focus entirely on the board instead of the machines beeping steadily beside his bed. At one point, my grandmother stepped out to speak with a nurse, and for a few minutes it was just the two of us, the soft beeping of the monitor and the quiet click of pieces I moved on his behalf. "I'm scared, Grandpa," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper, saying out loud something I hadn't allowed myself to say to anyone else since the diagnosis. He was quiet for a long moment, his breathing slow and labored. "Being scared doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong, Sam," he finally said. "It just means you understand what's actually happening. I'd be more worried about you if you weren't scared at all." "I don't know how to do this without you," I said. "The Sundays, all of it." "You won't be doing it without me," he said, his eyes finding mine with an effort that clearly cost him something. "You'll just be doing it with the version of me you're carrying inside you by now. 11 years of Sundays, Sam. That's not nothing. That doesn't disappear just because I do." Near the end of the game, in a position I genuinely couldn't read, a strange, sprawling arrangement of pieces that didn't resemble any standard tactic I recognized, my grandfather asked me to move his king forward, directly into what looked to my untrained eye like an obviously losing position. "Grandpa, that leaves you completely exposed." "Do it anyway," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Trust me, one more time." I moved the king forward, and then, with the last real clarity I would ever see in his eyes, he told me the final move of the game. "Checkmate," he said softly, and I stared at the board in genuine disbelief, tracing the pattern of pieces until I finally saw it. An intricate, patient trap he had been quietly building for nearly the entire 2 hours we'd been playing, one small sacrifice at a time, each move seemingly reckless in isolation, until the final position revealed exactly what all of it had been building toward. "How long were you planning that?" I asked, stunned. "Since the 8th move," he said, smiling faintly. "I told you, Sam, it's never about the clever move. It's about the quiet one nobody sees coming, 3 turns before it matters." He fell asleep shortly after that, and passed away peacefully 3 days later, with my hand in his, the chessboard packed carefully away in the small bag I'd brought from home, exactly where he'd asked me to keep it. It took me almost a year after the funeral before I could bring myself to set up that chessboard again. When I finally did, alone in my apartment on a quiet Sunday afternoon, out of habit more than any real plan, I found myself replaying that final game from memory, move by move, the way I'd replayed it in my mind 100 times since he'd passed. And somewhere around the 15th move, sitting alone at my own small table, I finally understood what he'd actually been trying to teach me. Not just in that final game, but across all the sacrifices he'd made in those last few months. The risks he'd started taking that would have terrified him only a year earlier. He hadn't been talking about chess at all. Not really. He'd been trying to tell me the only way a man like him ever knew how to say difficult things out loud, that a life spent only protecting what you already have will never build toward anything greater than simply staying safe. That sometimes the pieces worth sacrificing are exactly the ones you've spent your whole life guarding too carefully. That the quiet moves, the ones nobody notices in the moment, the risks that look like reckless losses to everyone watching, are so often the very moves that, years later, turn out to have been building toward the only checkmate that ever really mattered. I think about that final game often now, especially on the days when I'm afraid to take a risk in my own life. A job I want to leave, a relationship I'm scared to be vulnerable in, a dream I've kept quietly guarded instead of finally moving forward into the open. Last spring, nearly 2 years after he passed, I finally handed in my resignation letter at a job I'd outgrown years earlier, but had been too afraid to leave, too comfortable with the safety of a paycheck I no longer needed to prove anything about my worth. I sat in my car afterward, in the parking lot, and found myself laughing through tears, thinking about a chessboard and a man who'd spent his final months teaching me, one quiet sacrifice at a time, that safety and a well-lived life are not always the same thing. I keep that chessboard on a small table by my own window now, in the exact pattern of pieces from the moment he said checkmate, untouched, a permanent reminder of the last, best lesson my grandfather ever taught me. Not about a game, but about a life.
Sometimes the people who love us most don't get the chance to tell us everything they want us to know before they go. But if we're paying close enough attention, watching carefully in those final quiet moves, they find a way to tell us anyway.